Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1879. The dust of the cattle drive still hung in the air like a phantom, coating everything in Silverdale with a fine, pale powder. In a land where only the strongest survived, Preston Tanner had built himself a reputation as one of the most capable young cowboys in 3 counties. At 26, his hands were already calloused from years of hard work, but his face remained youthful beneath the wide brim of his Stetson, his jaw strong and clean-shaven most days, sporting only the lightest stubble when work kept him from town. Preston believed in a simple truth: the West was no place for attachment. He'd watched too many good men lose themselves to drink or despair after losing loved ones to disease, Indian raids, or the harsh elements. A smart cowboy rides alone, he often told himself. His father had died protecting their small homestead when Preston was just 14, and his mother had followed 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief. Since then, Preston had kept people at arm's length, convinced that closeness only set a man up for pain. What he wanted was straightforward enough: to save enough money working cattle to buy his own small ranch, a place where he answered to no one. What he needed, though he would deny it fiercely if asked, was something to fill the echoing emptiness that haunted him during long nights under the stars. Silverdale wasn't much as far as frontier towns went. One main street, a handful of wooden buildings with false fronts trying to appear grander than they were, and the inevitable saloon where most of the town's business, legitimate or otherwise, took place. Preston rode into town with the rest of the crew from the Circle M Ranch, their pockets full after the season's cattle drive and their minds set on spending some of it before heading back to winter quarters. "First rounds on the boss," shouted Mac, the trail boss, as they hitched their horses outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. The men gave a cheer that stirred up the street dust. Preston followed them in, but unlike the others who made straight for the bar or the card tables, his attention was caught by something unexpected. A young woman sat at the upright piano in the corner, her fingers moving deftly across the keys. She wasn't playing the usual raucous saloon tunes, but something softer, more complex. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore a modest blue dress that had seen better days. When she turned slightly, Preston could see that while not unattractive, she was plain by most standards, her nose a bit too prominent, her cheeks too angular for conventional beauty. What caught him, though, were her eyes, large, expressive, and a striking deep blue that seemed out of place in her otherwise ordinary face. Those eyes were focused entirely on the music, as if she had found a way to escape this dusty little town through the notes she played. "That's Hannah Voss," said Mac, noticing Preston's stare. "Folks call her the sparrow behind her back, plain little thing, but old man Voss brought that piano in by wagon all the way from Denver just for her. Cost him more than his house is worth, I reckon." Preston nodded absently, still watching as the song ended and several patrons applauded half-heartedly. The young woman, Hannah, acknowledged them with a shy nod before starting another piece. "Might as well be furniture to most folks here," continued Mac. "Been playing at the saloon since her pa lost their farm last year. Man drinks too much and gambles worse. She's 22, I hear, and likely to die an old maid in this town. Not much call for pianos out here, and not much else to recommend her." Preston frowned at Mac's assessment but said nothing. Something about the quiet dignity with which Hannah played, seemingly untroubled by the rowdy cowboys and miners around her, struck him as remarkable in a way he couldn't immediately define. Later that evening, as the saloon grew more crowded and loud, Preston found himself standing near the piano during a break in Hannah's playing. She was carefully arranging some sheet music when a drunken miner stumbled against the piano, sending the pages fluttering to the floor. "Sorry, miss," the miner slurred, not sounding sorry at all as he lurched away. Preston stepped forward, crouching to help gather the scattered music. "Here," he said, collecting several pages. When Hannah looked up at him, those striking blue eyes widening slightly in surprise, Preston felt an unexpected jolt, like the time he'd been thrown from his horse during a lightning storm. Up close, he could see a scattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks, and her lips, though thin, had a gentle curve to them. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Most men wouldn't bother." "My mother taught me better manners than most, I suppose," Preston replied, handing her the pages. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he noticed how smooth her hands were compared to the rough, work-hardened hands of most frontier women. "You're with the Circle M crew," she observed, "just in from the drive." Preston nodded, surprised she'd noticed. "Preston Tanner," he offered. "You play beautifully. Didn't expect to hear anything like that in Silverdale." A slight blush colored her cheeks. Hannah Voss, and thank you. I learned in St. Louis before we came west. Father thought my playing would help us socially when we arrived. A wry smile touched her lips. Turns out, cattlemen and miners care more about whether you can shoot straight or cook a decent meal than whether you can play choppin'. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that made Preston curious. Before he could respond, a heavy hand clapped him on the shoulder. "Tanner, we're starting a game, you in?" It was Levi, one of the younger hands, already red-faced from whiskey. In a minute, Preston answered, turning back to Hannah, but she was already settling herself at the piano again, the moment broken. "Don't waste your time there," Levi said in a stage whisper that carried easily. "The sparrow's not worth singing for, if you know what I mean." Preston's jaw tightened at the casual cruelty, but Hannah had already begun to play, her face composed as if she hadn't heard, though a telltale redness at the tips of her ears suggested otherwise. "I'll play cards another night," Preston said firmly, moving to lean against the wall near the piano instead of following Levi. He told himself he was just appreciating the music, but something about Hannah Voss had caught his attention in a way that both intrigued and unsettled him. Over the next few days, as the Circle M crew rested in town before heading back to the ranch, Preston found himself returning to the Silver Dollar each evening. He'd nurse a single whiskey and listen to Hannah play, occasionally exchanging a few words with her during her breaks. He learned that she lived with her father in a small cabin at the edge of town, that she'd lost her mother to cholera on the journey west, and that she read voraciously whenever she could get her hands on books. On the fourth night, as Hannah was preparing to leave, an older man with a florid face and trembling hands approached her. Her father, Preston, guessed, recognizing the same prominent nose and high forehead. "Time to go, Hannah," the man said, his words slightly slurred. "Unless you've made enough for another hand or two." His eyes darted hopefully toward the card tables. "No, father," Hannah replied quietly, "but Mr. Barnes paid me for the week. It should cover what we need." The disappointment on John Voss's face was plain, and Preston saw Hannah's shoulders slump slightly as she gathered her things. Acting on impulse, Preston stepped forward. "Mr. Voss." "Preston Tanner, Circle M Ranch." He extended his hand. "I was wondering if I might call on your daughter tomorrow afternoon. I'll be heading back to the ranch soon, and I'd like to speak with her before I go." Both Hannah and her father looked equally startled, though for different reasons. John Voss recovered first, eyeing Preston's good quality clothes and the gleaming silver buckle on his belt, signs of a man who was careful with his wages. "Of course, young man," John said, suddenly more sober, "we'd be honored." "Say 2 o'clock. Hannah's expression was harder to read, surprise certainly, but also wariness and something that might have been hope. "Is that acceptable to you, Miss Voss?" Preston asked directly, holding her gaze. After a moment she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Tanner, 2 o'clock tomorrow would be fine." As Preston watched them leave, Mac appeared at his elbow. "What game are you playing, Tanner?" "The Sparrow's not the kind of woman cowboys usually court." "Who said anything about courting?" Preston replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what had prompted his invitation. Mac shook his head. "Just be careful. Small towns have long memories, and that girl's had enough disappointment without you adding to it." The next day, Preston arrived at the Voss cabin precisely at 2, wearing his best shirt and carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. The cabin was neat but desperately in need of repair, with missing shingles and a sagging porch step that creaked alarmingly under his weight. John Voss answered his knock, ushering him in with exaggerated courtesy. The interior was small but scrupulously clean. A curtain divided the single room, presumably separating sleeping areas. What caught Preston's attention, however, was the upright piano against one wall, clearly the finest thing the family owned, polished to a shine despite its age. Hannah emerged from behind the curtain, wearing the same blue dress he'd seen at the saloon, though she'd added a ribbon to her hair. She offered him a tentative smile. "Mr. Tanner, welcome to our home." "Miss Voss," he replied, suddenly feeling awkward. He handed her the package. "Just a small token. I noticed you reading during your breaks." Hannah unwrapped the gift carefully, a copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that Preston had purchased from the general store that morning. "Poetry?" Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Thank you. I've read about this work but never had the opportunity to read it myself." John Voss cleared his throat. "I have some business in town," he announced. "I trust you young people will observe proper decorum." He gave Preston a meaningful look before taking his hat and leaving, the door closing with a decisive snap behind him. "He's going to the saloon," Hannah said matter-of-factly once he was gone. "He'll lose whatever money I made last night at the poker tables. There was resignation in her voice but not surprise. "I'm sorry," Preston said, genuinely meaning it. Hannah shrugged slightly. "It's been his way of coping since Mother died. The drinking got worse after we lost the farm." She gestured to the room. "Please sit, would you like some tea?" "It's just herbal, I'm afraid." As they sat together, an awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Preston spoke. "I'm leaving tomorrow to head back to the Circle M. We'll be busy with fall roundup and preparing for winter." "I see," Hannah replied, her expression carefully neutral. "That's why you wanted to call today, to say goodbye." "Partly," Preston admitted, "but also because I've enjoyed our conversations. You're not like anyone else I've met out here." A flash of something hurt resignation crossed her face. "Because I play piano or because I'm plain?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "Because you seem to see beyond Silverdale," he answered honestly. "Most people here are just trying to survive or get rich or keep from going mad from loneliness. You? You bring beauty to a place that has precious little of it." Hannah studied him for a long moment. "That's a pretty speech, Mr. Tanner, but I wonder if you'd have noticed me at all if I'd been churning butter instead of playing Beethoven." Her candor was refreshing, if uncomfortable. Preston found himself smiling. "Probably not," he conceded, "but I'm glad I did notice you." They talked for over an hour, about books they'd read, about his life on the ranch and her dreams of perhaps teaching music someday. Preston found himself speaking of things he rarely mentioned: his parents' deaths, his loneliness on the trail, his hope for his own place someday. As he prepared to leave, Preston hesitated at the door. "I'll be back in town come spring, after the thaw." Hannah nodded, her expression guarded. "Safe travels, Mr. Tanner." "Preston," he corrected. "Preston," she echoed softly. "Goodbye." As he mounted his horse, Preston felt strangely reluctant to leave. There was something about Hannah Voss that had gotten under his skin, not just her music or her intelligence, but a quiet strength that seemed to sustain her despite her circumstances. Throughout the winter at Circle M, as snow piled high around the bunkhouse and the men passed the long evenings with cards and tall tales, Preston found his thoughts drifting back to Silverdale more often than he cared to admit. He'd received a single letter from Hannah in December, a thank you for the book, along with her thoughts on several of the poems. He'd read it so many times the paper was becoming thin at the folds. "You sweet on someone, Tanner?" asked Mac one evening, catching Preston reading the letter again by lamplight. "You've been mighty distracted since we left town." "Just passing time," Preston replied, tucking the letter away. Mac gave him a knowing look. "Wouldn't be the Voss girl, would it? Because that would be a mighty strange choice for a man with your prospects." "And what prospects are those?" Preston asked, an edge to his voice. "You're the best cowhand I've got," Mac said seriously. "Smart with cattle, good with a rope, and you've saved almost every penny you've earned. In a few years you could have your own spread. Most girls in 3 counties would jump at the chance to marry you." He paused. "The Sparrow's a decent enough girl, I suppose, but she comes with a drunk for a father and not much else." "Her name is Hannah," Preston said quietly. "And I'm not sweet on anyone. I just appreciate someone who can hold a conversation about something other than cattle or cards." But as winter gave way to spring and the first cattle drive of the season approached, Preston found himself increasingly eager to return to Silverdale. Something had changed in him during those long winter months, a realization that the solitary future he'd planned for himself no longer held the appeal it once did. When the Circle M crew finally rode into Silverdale in late April, Preston's first stop was the Silver Dollar. But the piano in the corner stood silent, a different girl serving drinks where Hannah had once played. "Looking for Miss Voss?" asked Barnes, the saloon owner, noticing Preston's confusion. "She's not working here anymore." A cold feeling settled in Preston's stomach. What happened? Is she all right? Barnes shrugged. "Old John Voss died in February. Pneumonia, they say, though the whiskey probably didn't help. The girl's been taking in sewing and laundry to make ends meet. Lives in that same cabin still." Relief flooded through Preston, followed immediately by concern. Without her father, Hannah would be in a precarious position in a town like Silverdale, where unmarried women without family were vulnerable in multiple ways. The next morning, Preston made his way to the Voss cabin. It looked even more dilapidated than he remembered, with new gaps in the roof and a window patched with oilskin. He knocked on the door, suddenly nervous in a way that facing down stampeding cattle had never made him. When the door opened, he barely recognized Hannah. She was thinner, with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her dark brown hair was pulled back severely, and her hands were red and raw-looking from lye soap and hot water. Preston, surprise and something like joy flashed across her face before she composed herself. "I mean, Mr. Tanner. I didn't know you were back in town." "Just arrived yesterday," he said. "I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss." Hannah nodded, then seemed to remember her manners. "Please come in. I was just about to have some tea." The inside of the cabin had changed dramatically. The piano remained, but much of the other furniture was gone, presumably sold. Piles of laundry waiting to be washed were stacked neatly in one corner, and a sewing basket overflowed with mending. "You're not playing at the saloon anymore," Preston observed as Hannah poured tea into the single remaining cup which she offered to him. "No," she said simply, "after father died." Well, a woman alone playing piano in a saloon invites certain assumptions. Mr. Barnes was understanding, but we agreed it would be better if I found other work. The practical dignity with which she stated this made Preston's heart ache. "It must be difficult." Hannah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I manage. The laundry pays enough for food and the mending covers the rent. I'm one of the lucky ones, at least I have skills beyond cooking and cleaning." She paused. "But you didn't come to hear about my troubles. How was your winter at Circle M?" They talked for a while, falling back into the easy conversation they'd established before, though Preston could sense Hannah holding something back. Finally, as he prepared to leave, he gathered his courage. "I was wondering if you might like to join me for dinner at the hotel tomorrow evening," he said. "They have a proper dining room, and I've heard the food is decent." Hannah looked genuinely startled. "Dinner with me at the hotel?" "Yes," Preston confirmed, suddenly worried he'd overstepped. "People would talk," she said quietly. "The Sparrow dining with one of the most eligible cowboys in the territory. It would cause quite a stir." Preston frowned. "I don't care what people say, and I wish you wouldn't call yourself that." "It's what everyone calls me," Hannah replied with that same practical acceptance that both impressed and frustrated him. "And you should care what people say. Your reputation matters in your line of work." "So does yours," Preston countered, "and I'd say being seen with a respectable cowboy from a good outfit would only improve it." Hannah studied him for a long moment, those remarkable blue eyes searching his face. Finally she nodded. "All right, Mr. Tanner, dinner tomorrow at the hotel, 6 o'clock. "Preston," he corrected again with a smile. "Preston," she echoed, and this time there was a warmth in her voice that stayed with him long after he'd left. The next evening Preston waited nervously in the hotel lobby, wearing his best clothes and freshly shaved. When Hannah entered, he almost didn't recognize her. She wore a deep green dress that he hadn't seen before, her hair arranged in a more flattering style that softened her angular features. But it was the confidence in her posture that transformed her, head high, shoulders back, moving with a grace that drew eyes from around the room. "You look beautiful," Preston said honestly as he offered his arm. "Thank you," Hannah replied with a small smile. "The dress was my mother's. I've been altering it bit by bit when I have time." As they were seated in the hotel dining room, the fanciest establishment in Silverdale, though that wasn't saying much, Preston was acutely aware of the stares and whispers from the other diners. Hannah seemed to notice too, but she maintained her composure, unfolding her napkin with deliberate care. "I told you people would talk," she murmured, though there was more amusement than discomfort in her tone. "Let them," Preston replied. "Maybe it will give them something new to gossip about besides cattle prices and the weather." Dinner was pleasant, the food better than Preston had expected. They talked easily, with Hannah sharing stories of her childhood in St. Louis and Preston describing life on the trail. As the meal concluded, Hannah's expression grew more serious. "Why did you ask me to dinner, Preston, truly?" The directness of her question, so typical of her, made him pause. "Because I enjoy your company," he said finally. "Because when I'm with you I don't feel like I need to be just a cowboy, I can be myself." "And who is that?" she asked softly. "Who is Preston Tanner when he's not being a cowboy?" It was a question no one had ever asked him before, and Preston found himself at a loss. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out. And I'd like your help doing it." The walk back to Hannah's cabin was quiet, both of them lost in thought. At her door, Preston hesitated. "May I call on you again tomorrow?" he asked. Hannah looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "People really will talk if you keep this up." "Let them," Preston said again, more firmly this time. After a moment Hannah nodded. "Yes, you may call tomorrow. But Preston, I need to know what this is. I'm not in a position to indulge in complications. Preston understood what she was asking. In frontier towns, unmarried women had to guard their reputations fiercely or risk ruin. I respect you, Hannah. I would never do anything to harm your standing in this town. It wasn't quite an answer to her question, but Hannah seemed to accept it with a nod. Tomorrow then, good night, Preston. Over the next 2 weeks, Preston called on Hannah every day that he wasn't required at the ranch. They walked along the creek, attended a church social, causing even more talk among the townspeople, and spent hours on her porch simply talking. Preston found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he'd kept locked away since his parents' deaths, and Hannah gradually revealed more of her own hopes and fears. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Hannah finally told him the full story of how her family had come west. Father was a professor of literature in St. Louis, she explained. Respected, comfortable, but not wealthy. Then the war came, and afterward everything changed. His position was eliminated and he started drinking. Mother thought a fresh start in the West might help him recover himself, she sighed. When she died on the trail, something in him broke completely. The farm was meant to be our new beginning, but he had no idea how to work the land. Preston listened, understanding better now the contrast between Hannah's education and her current circumstances. And the piano, how did that survive when everything else was lost? Hannah's face softened. It was Mother's originally. When Father knew he was going to lose the farm, he sold almost everything else first. He may have been a drunk, but he knew what that piano meant to me. It was the one thing from our old life he couldn't bear to part with. He must have loved you very much, Preston observed. In his way, Hannah agreed. Though love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes practical matters overwhelm even the best intentions. There was a wisdom in her words that struck Preston deeply. His own parents had loved each other devotedly, but that love hadn't been enough to keep his mother alive after his father was gone. Perhaps this was what had made him so determined to rely only on himself, the recognition that love, however powerful, was ultimately fragile in the face of frontier hardships. As spring turned to early summer, Preston found himself at a crossroads. Circle M would be sending a herd north to Montana soon, a journey that would keep him away until fall. The thought of leaving Silverdale, of leaving Hannah, filled him with a restlessness he couldn't quite name. One evening, as they walked by Silver Creek, Preston finally voiced the thoughts that had been troubling him. I've been saving for my own ranch, he told Hannah. I'm closer than most men my age. Another year or two and I could put a down payment on a decent piece of land. Hannah nodded, her face giving nothing away. That's always been your dream, hasn't it? Independence. It was, Preston agreed, but lately I've been wondering if independence is really what I want after all. Hannah stopped walking, turning to face him directly. What are you saying, Preston? I'm saying that my plans have changed since I met you, he replied honestly, that the thought of my own ranch doesn't mean much if I'd be living there alone. Hannah's eyes widened. Preston, I'm not asking anything of you right now, he hurried to add. I know it's too soon. I just wanted you to know that when I head north with the herd next week, I'll be thinking about more than just cattle and land prices. I'll be thinking about possibilities I never considered before. Hannah was quiet for so long that Preston began to worry he'd overstepped. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never been the kind of woman men notice, she said. Not in St. Louis and certainly not here. I made peace with that long ago. I noticed you, Preston said simply. Yes, Hannah agreed, a slight smile touching her lips. You did. And I still don't fully understand why. Preston took her hand, an intimacy they'd not shared before. Because you're extraordinary, Hannah Voss, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. The Montana drive kept Preston away from Silverdale for nearly 4 months. He wrote to Hannah when he could, sending letters with writers heading south. Her replies were infrequent but treasured, thoughtful reflections on her days, books she'd read, and gradually, tentative expressions of how much she missed their conversations. By the time Preston returned to Silverdale in October, his mind was made up. He'd spoken with Mac about his intentions, and the older man, while still dubious, had given Preston his blessing and a small bonus for his exceptional work during the drive. Preston's first stop was the general store, where he purchased a small box of chocolates from back east, an extravagance that cost nearly a week's wages. His second stop was the Voss cabin, his heart pounding as he approached the door. Hannah answered his knock immediately, as if she'd been waiting. She looked healthier than when he'd left, with more color in her cheeks and a new ribbon in her hair. "You're back," she said simply, joy evident in her voice despite her restrained words. "I'm back," Preston confirmed, unable to keep from smiling. "May I come in? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." Inside the cabin, Preston noticed small improvements: a patched roof, new curtains, a second chair at the table. Hannah had clearly been working hard in his absence. "Your home looks nice," he observed. "I've had more sewing work lately," Hannah explained. "Mrs. Perkins from the general store has been recommending me to people passing through." "It's helped." Preston handed her the box of chocolates, which she accepted with delight. "These must have cost a fortune," she said. "You shouldn't have spent your wages so foolishly." "It's not foolish if it makes you happy," Preston replied. Then, gathering his courage, he continued. "Hannah, I've been doing a lot of thinking while I was away." "So have I," she admitted, setting the chocolates aside and meeting his gaze directly. "I want to court you properly," Preston said, "with the intention of marriage if you'll have me." Hannah's expression was complicated, joy mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Preston, you need to know something first, something about me that might change how you feel." Preston frowned, concerned by her sudden seriousness. "Whatever it is, Hannah, it won't change how I feel about you." "It might," she insisted. Taking a deep breath, she continued. "When Father died, I discovered something among his papers, something he'd kept from me all these years." Her hands twisted together nervously. "My mother wasn't my mother." "Not by birth." Preston blinked, not understanding the significance. "You were adopted." "No," Hannah said, her voice strained. "I was born to a woman named Sarah Blackfeather. She was half Cheyenne. Father was stationed at a fort near the reservation as a young soldier before he became a professor. They had a relationship. When Sarah died in childbirth, Father brought me back to St. Louis. He met and married the woman I knew as mother a year later. They raised me as their own." The revelation hung in the air between them. In the Wyoming Territory of 1879, having Indian blood, even half, was something many people would consider shameful or even dangerous to admit. "That's why I've always looked different," Hannah continued when Preston didn't immediately respond. "My father thought it was kinder to let me believe I was fully white. In St. Louis, with my education and manners, no one questioned it. But here in the West, where people are more familiar with Indian features," she trailed off. "Is that why people call you the Sparrow?" Preston asked, pieces falling into place. "Because they suspect." Hannah shook her head. "No, that's just because I'm plain and quiet. As far as I know, no one here suspects my heritage. Father made me promise never to tell anyone when he realized he was dying." Her eyes searched Preston's face anxiously. "Now you understand why I need to know exactly what your intentions are. If people were to discover my background, it would affect you too." Preston was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. Finally, he stepped forward and took both her hands in his. "Hannah Voss, I've spent my entire adult life believing that the surest way to survive out here was to depend on no one but myself. Watching my parents taught me that loving someone meant risking everything." He squeezed her hands gently. "But knowing you has shown me that there are some risks worth taking, some connections worth fighting for." Tears filled Hannah's eyes. "You don't care about my heritage." "I care about who you are," Preston said firmly. "Your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. The blood in your veins doesn't change any of that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring, silver with a single pearl. "I'm asking you to marry me, Hannah. To build a life with me. It won't be easy, and there might be people who don't approve for all sorts of reasons, but I believe we could face whatever comes our way together." Hannah stared at the ring, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "You're certain, even knowing what I've told you?" "More certain than I've ever been about anything," Preston assured her. With trembling fingers, Hannah took the ring. "Then yes, Preston Tanner. I will marry you." News of their engagement spread through Silverdale like wildfire. The reactions were predictably mixed, some offering genuine congratulations, others barely concealing their shock that the Sparrow had managed to catch one of the most promising young cowboys in the territory. Mac took Preston aside when he heard, "You're really going through with this?" "I am," Preston confirmed, "and I'd like your blessing." The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You know your own mind, Tanner, and while I don't fully understand your choice, I respect that it's yours to make." He clapped Preston on the shoulder. "Besides, any woman who can play piano like that and still handle frontier living has more spine than most." They were married 2 weeks later in Silverdale's small church, with Mac standing as Preston's best man and Mrs. Perkins from the general store serving as Hannah's matron of honor. Hannah wore her mother's dress, now fully altered to fit her perfectly, and played a piece on the church's out-of-tune organ that brought tears to several eyes, including Preston's. With his savings, Preston was able to put a down payment on a small ranch about 10 miles outside of Silverdale. Nothing grand, but a solid start with a small house, a barn, and enough land for a modest herd to grow over time. The piano was the first thing they moved in, taking pride of place in their sparse front room. Their first year together brought challenges, as Preston had known it would. There were neighbors who kept their distance once rumors about Hannah's possible heritage began to circulate, and merchants in town who suddenly found their prices higher when the Tanners came to shop. But there were also unexpected allies. Mac and the Circle M Cowboys who made a point of stopping by whenever they were in the area, Mrs. Perkins who continued to send sewing work Hannah's way, and a handful of homesteaders who judged people by their actions rather than their bloodlines. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their small ranch house watching the sunset, Hannah rested her head against Preston's shoulder. Her hand, resting on her slightly rounded belly, gently caressed the child growing within her. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. "Truly." Preston covered her hand with his own. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he answered honestly. "I spent so many years believing that love was a weakness out here, that caring for someone would only end in heartbreak. And now," Hannah prompted, "now I know that love is the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile," he said, gesturing to the vast landscape stretching before them. "The land, the cattle, the struggle, it would all be empty without someone to share it with, without you." Hannah smiled, turning her face up to his. "You know what people in town still say, don't you? That the handsome cowboy chose the ugly duckling, and no one can figure out why." Preston laughed softly. "Let them wonder, we know the truth." "And what truth is that?" Hannah asked, her blue eyes reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight. "That sometimes the most precious things aren't what shine the brightest at first glance," Preston replied. "Sometimes they're the quiet ones that reveal their beauty slowly to those patient enough to truly see." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Preston Tanner held his wife close, marveling at how thoroughly his life had changed. The solitary path he'd once been so certain of had given way to something far richer, a shared journey with a woman whose quiet strength and hidden depths had transformed him completely. In Hannah he had found not just a wife, but a partner who understood both the harshness and the beauty of frontier life. Together, they would build something that could withstand whatever the Wyoming Territory might throw at them, a family, a home, and a love as enduring as the mountains on the horizon.